He was a voice that lived in her bones. In the cheap fluorescence of the subway car, Aretha felt it first not as an idea, but as pressure, an old gravity that bent her shoulders forward, pinned her ribs. Someone had called her a ghost often enough that she could feel the shape of the word in the bruise behind her ear. Her red handbag sat in her lap, like a small hot thing she had to keep from bursting. The light from the tunnel carved hard lines across her face. The skin beneath her eye was a bruise the color of old fruit. Her hands trembled until she folded them around the strap and forced them to stillness. Crowds blurred into a single swaying mass of anonymous backs. The subway smelled of metal and stale rain and the faint sweetness of someone's perfume. A man across from her dozed with a newspaper over his face. A boy kicked his shoe against the bench, restless and unconcerned. To anyone else, she was one more commuter, a tired woman with a red bag, the kind of silhouette that goes unnoticed. To Jerry, she had been a canvas to repaint whenever he chose. To herself, until that night, she had been the canvas he kept scrawled on. Memory arrived with the train's lurch. Jerry's low, practiced voice promising that she would always be alone. No family to answer for her, no mother or brother to come running. He had filled that loneliness with a doctrine. "You're an orphan," he had whispered once after a fight, as if the word could explain away his cruelty. "No one owes you rescue." It would first convince her, then isolate her, then justify everything that came next. The phrase had been the slow invention of a cage. She kept her chin tucked, not because it helped, but because any small change in posture felt like an invitation. The car rattled on. A woman in a yellow scarf boarded and sat near the door. Someone laughed somewhere, small and private. Aretha focused on her breath, one steady in and out, trying to measure time in things that weren't words. Then he took a seat without her seeing him enter. He didn't sit opposite, didn't sit in the aisle. He sat 3 seats away, as if the geometry of the car itself had allowed him the exact line from which to observe without intruding. He was not loud. His jacket was dark and clean, his hands rested on his knees, and when the light caught his wrist, a tattoo between cuff and skin swam into view. A dragon, scales inked in a way that split light. He had the sort of face that made you feel like he had been watching the city for years and had learned its private arrangements. He watched Aretha the way a reader watches an opening line, attentive and patient. There was no pity in his gaze. There was a quiet, appraising curiosity. Where Jerry's presence in her life had been a press, always too close, always claiming space, this man's was a measure. When the train sighed and the brakes held, she felt it like the difference between being squeezed and being contained. He didn't speak. He simply glanced once at the bruise, then at her eyes, then toward the sliding doors. A fraction of a second later on the platform, Jerry's heavy boots clattered like accusation. Jerry's face was easier to predict, a weathered hardness, a grin that held too many teeth. He stepped onto the platform like a man who owned its echoes. The crowd shifted to make room for him without a sound. The city taught people how to give space to those who intimidated. He didn't look for Aretha at first. He looked like someone checking his route, but when his eyes found her, the world tightened. The man with the dragon tattoo rose as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. He moved with deliberate economy, a single quiet stride that closed the gap between the car and the platform. He stood between Jerry and Aretha like a new boundary drawn in the air, a line that did not require speech to exist. Jerry stepped forward, the kind of forwardness that translates into ownership. He smiled then, a lean, practiced expression. "Thought I'd find you here," he said, and the words slotted into the silence like a nail. The man with the dragon watched him for 2 heartbeats, then threw a glance not at Jerry but at the other commuters, at their faces, at the single policeman leaning by the exit. The man's voice when he spoke was low, not raised for the crowd but pitched to unmake a man. "She's with me," he said. There was no plea in the sentence, no begging, just currency, an assertion. Jerry's grin faltered, a small loss like a shudder in the wind. He looked from the man to Aretha and back again, a calculation in motion. The man with the dragon's hand rested on his watch, a trivial motion that contained an implied warning. more force in posture than in language. For one trembling second, the platform felt as if the crowd had taken a long breath. "You think you can tell me what to do?" Jerry said, and there was something like a hurl in his tone. "She's not yours to order," the man said. His words were flat, a diagnostic statement, not a plea or a sermon. The weight of them landed with a kind of clarity that made Jerry blink. Jerry had always relied on small, repetitive cruelties to keep Aretha's world tidy. He spoke of abandonment as proof of unworthiness. He hollowness sold her until she matched his definition. He had never expected a third party to reject his claim so efficiently. For all his bluster, he hesitated, and then he walked away with the careful grace of a man retreating so he could return. Aretha watched without moving. The man didn't reach for her. He didn't move as if to take her hand. He simply boarded the same train. She felt a pull, part gratitude, part terror, part the strange recognition that the world had shifted and left her to decide what came next. When the doors sealed and the car began to move, he tilted his head once toward her and said, without the smallest softness, "Get off at the next stop." She could have argued. She could have demanded to be let off here, on the platform, among strangers and guards and the possibility of being followed. She could have stayed on the train, tried to become invisible again until the city swallowed her. Instead, she did what felt almost reckless. She stood, gathered the red strap of her bag in both hands, and followed him. If this is the sort of story that holds your attention, take a moment now, if you want, to subscribe. There's more like this coming. The night had thinned into a kind of neon smear by the time they reached the transfer. The car smelled of ozone and a faint trace of cologne. He led her through a corridor that smelled of mop water and the faint petroleum tang of the city. No conversation larger than a courier's nod. When they emerged above ground, the rain hit their faces like a hand. He moved without looking like a man who understood how to cross a city that might be watching. A black sedan waited half a block away, idling with its windows up. Two men in dark suits stood beside it, their hands folded in a posture that read as both protective and clinical. One had a scar through his eyebrow. The other's jaw was a slab of muscle. They didn't approach Aretha with warmth. They opened the door with military courtesy. The car's interior was cool and scented with leather. The city slid past in ribbons of light. It felt obscene and oddly comforting to be cocooned in such deliberate luxury after the fluorescent cage of the subway. She watched the skyline tilt toward them as they climbed. The man in the suit with the dragon tattoo finally spoke in a way that demanded an answer. "What's your name?" he asked. "Aretha," she said, saying it felt like a test. The syllables had weight now that someone else had called them aloud. "Aretha," he repeated. He didn't soften the word. He repeated it as a name to be mapped, not as a label clipped on. "You came." She didn't say why. She had choices she carried in the space between them, to stay with Jerry and risk the small, monstrous daily warfare, to vanish into the city and hope anonymity could be a home, to accept whatever this man offered and face an unknown anchored by men who functioned like a private army. Each option had danger and cost. She chose the cost she could see. The penthouse they arrived at looked like no refuge she'd ever pictured. It was not the warm rescue of a friend's open door. Instead, it was constructed like a fortification translated into interior design. Austere lines, glass that made the city below look like a grid of lights, and rooms laid out with an efficient distance between them. The floors were cool underfoot. The air inside was dry and precise, as if someone had calibrated it to remove the muddle of the outside world. Security panels glowed like small, obedient suns. He didn't offer condolences. He showed her to a room where towels waited on a chair, and a robe lay folded on the bed. The bathroom was broad and clinical, a shallow pool of steam when she used the shower. She scrubbed herself until the water ran clear of the salt that stained her skin, then wrapped herself in the robe and sat on the edge of the bed. The mirror over the sink offered the face of a woman who had been broken, but not gone. She looked at the bruise and noted the colors like a scientist cataloging a specimen, rather than an observer feeling pity. That was a new kind of control. He told her he would not pretend to be good. He used the word once and let it sit between them like a foreign coin. "This place is not sanctuary," he said. She believed him. He explained with a bluntness that read as warning that his business involved arrangements the law would frown on and neighbors would whisper about. She listened and felt the interrogative edges of her own surrender. She liked him less for the things he had done, and perhaps more for how frank he was about them. Instead of consolation, he offered language that reframed the wound Jerry had used against her. He talked about the orphan label not as a sentence, but as a strange, dangerous freedom. "If no one holds you accountable to someone else's script," he said, "you can write your own." He did not deliver the line like a salvation. He offered it like a tool, metallic and cold, and watched to see if she would pick it up. She did. Picking it up felt like theft and like reclamation at once. They did not startle into friendship. He set terms. She would be safe for as long as she wanted to remain. But safety in his world meant learning to read a room and to claim one at will. The first lesson was posture. It was a small enough thing that it should have been trivial. But when he corrected the way she stood, lifting her sternum a little, setting the shoulders back, it changed how people arranged themselves around her. "Eyes first," he said. "Your brow tells your intention. Hold it steady." She practiced in front of the long mirrors that lined one hallway. At first, the motion felt false and acted dignity. She could hear Jerry's voice in the edges. "It is a husk, a fake, but refinement is a habitual thing." She walked the length of the penthouse, measured her stride, and for the first time in years she felt the floor acknowledge her steps. The guards stopped treating her like a frightened animal. They began to clear a small space around her when she moved through a room. The smallest concessions were a kind of recognition. "Power," the man said once, while they were in the living room where the city glittered like sequins on a girder, "is more often noticed than it is used." He meant, as he always had meant, presence over brawn. He taught her to meet a room with a look that asked nothing but answered everything. He showed her how to be centered when someone tried to push at the edges of her. There were other things he showed her, the practicalities of his world that did not involve him teaching violence, but rather imparted the language of control. He invited her to sit in the small command center on the third night, where monitors displayed feeds from cameras around the building and streets that could be watched like maps on a table. He introduced her to methodical men who spoke in low tones and wore the patience of trained animals. He did not do it to parade power so much as to show the scaffolding that kept the place secure. Watching those feeds, Aretha began to understand the mechanics of protection as systems of attention and response. She learned the names of the people who kept the lights on, who filed reports, who ensured food reached the rooms on time. She learned that safety here was not mythic. It was a structure composed of people who bore arms and others who paid attention to lists. It would be wrong to imagine that she was healed by convenience. Nights she lay awake and felt the old voice whispering its doctrines. She would wake and sit on the edge of the bed and practice the posture he had taught. Each breath out was an unhooking from the lie that she would always be orphaned. He told her part of his own story in small shards, not in confession, but in parallel. He had been shaped by absence, by a childhood that taught him to measure loyalty like currency. He did not ask for her gratitude, he never requested it. At times he revealed how his own orphan roots had taught him to build structures of power, not to tender love, but to guarantee safety. The parallel did not redeem him. It only explained why he believed in the exact trade he offered. Refuge in exchange for presence and a tacit acceptance of the debts and moral murk of his world. Time passed in precise measures, training sessions of posture and voice, showers that made her skin feel new in a disposable way, and quiet nights where the penthouse hummed and she listened to the city confess its loneliness. At the edges of this new rhythm, she began to try on small acts of autonomy. She changed a phone number. She chose the color of a dress because she wanted the way it made her step feel different. She refused a dinner guest who asked questions about her past. She made decisions that were hers to make. Each choice stitched a seam in the world that Jerry had tried to rend. Jerry did not accept being dismissed. He refused to be the man abandoned. He dressed his wounded pride into plans. He found someone willing to listen to his complaint, people whose own businesses were run on keeping scores. He traded favors and information for the chance to probe the weak seam in the penthouse's armor. He had seen the man with the dragon and interpreted the intervention as humiliation to be corrected. It is a particular kind of male rage to conflate being ignored with being defeated. He met one of the rival syndicate's lieutenants in a dim bar where the air tasted of cigarette smoke and old whiskey. They swore with the visible intimacy of men who had built small empires on the backs of other people's fear. They exchanged files like people exchange coins, names, times, a petty betrayal here and there. Jerry promised value. Where there was ego, there was always an offer. The rival men were interested not out of altruism, but because opportunity glinted. A den vulnerable was a way to expand a map. Inside the penthouse, something shifted. Monitors that had previously shown only street corners now displayed faces in the distance that would be moving toward them. Lines of light that were usually the slow decisions of the city began to snap into motion. The guards moved with a rehearsed calm that made it more frightening than a panic. Jima did not hurry. He rearranged. There was a sense that the building itself was an organism preparing a particular, certain defense. Aretha, who had previously been told to stay behind because she was fragile, found herself present in the room where decisions were made. They explained to her, not to teach how to fight, but to ask for her choice. For the first time, she was consulted about strategy of concealment and exposure. Where she wanted to be should men come for them. She did not ask for specifics. She declined to be passive. "We stand our ground," she said, and in the way the sentence was formed there was no bravado. There was a decision. Jima watched her. There was admiration in his stillness, but it was laced with caution. The men outside might come in search of the petty triumph of making her small again. If they did, the truth was that the penthouse's soldiers would act, and the men who paid for their services would do what was necessary. There would be blood if they failed. It was a ledger of consequences. He said nothing about glory. He told her, plainly, "If they come, you'll be in the center. I want you to stay there." She understood why. Occupying the center not only made a statement about control, it was also a way to show Jerry that his leverage had ended. He could not pull the strings of her presence anymore if she refused to be moved. Night thickened into the kind of rain that makes the air smell like metal. They heard the sound of arrivals, cars pulling up, men moving with the economy of purpose. The cameras picked them up as blotches at first, then as men in jackets, then as figures aligning. The command center's lights made small moons on their faces as the team prepared. When the door finally opened, it felt oddly ceremonial. Jerry stood there with an expression that had moved past anger into a kind of defeated frenzy. He had not come alone. A group followed him, more like a pack than a group, each man carrying the visible hunger of having been promised a chance to restore order to their world. Jerry's eyes moved over the room and landed on Aretha. There was a moment when he thought he would take her by force of will alone, as if his voice could make her small. He began to speak not in whispers but in the old, familiar cadence that had disciplined her for years. "You don't get to wear that like a shield," he said, and the words were chewed like something he had practiced. Aretha stood in the foyer where the light came down like a spotlight. She had not come to the room wearing armor. She wore a simple dress and the posture he had taught her. The chin slightly lifted, the shoulders square, eyes steady. Her red bag sat in a corner as if it had become a relic. She had left it there deliberately. She said nothing at first. Her silence was not emptiness. It was attention. Jerry advanced in the small way that men with old habits do, a swagger he took for dominance. "You owe me," he said. "You can't just— You called me what I was not," she said. Her voice was calm and quiet, not designed to scatter the room, but it carried. "You told me I was nothing without others. I learned something else. I learned how to stand." Her words were not an accusation in the theatrical sense. They were a factual re-evaluation. Jerry's face, which had thrived on a power made of repeating itself, lost color. He looked at the men he had brought and then at the soldiers in the room, and for the first time he seemed to comprehend that the balance had shifted. The soldiers did not move to violence because they enjoyed it. They moved out of the clarity of orders given. The rival men hesitated. Perhaps they had not expected to meet resistance. Perhaps they had imagined a frightened woman to paralyze into compliance. The sight of Aretha standing gave them a picture of a different sort of problem. Here was someone whose presence had been reclaimed. Jima's lieutenants did not bark orders. They contained. They stepped forward with a neutral efficiency that neutralized the threat without performative cruelty. The rival leader's plan evaporated the way a cloud does in wind. Jerry's face contorted in ways that exposed how small vindication had been for him. He tried to reach her, to grab her arm to show he still could. A thin line of menace passed, quickly halted by the nearest guard, whose hand landed on Jerry's shoulder with a contact that did not bruise but did assert reality. "You leave now," the guard said. It was a sentence without exclamation, which made it harder to refuse. Jerry's last act was not one of dignity. He tore his eyes from her and stomped away, the men who had followed him trailing like husks. They left behind a room in which the air had changed. No one cheered. No one made speeches. The penthouse resumed the balanced hum of its machines. The cameras continued to blink. Outside, the city kept being the city. Aretha stayed in the center of the foyer until the guards told her she could move. She felt a strange lightness, as if something had been unlatched inside. It was not victory in the mythic sense. No triumphant music. No public recognition. It was quieter. A removal of an invisible weight. She walked slowly across the floor, feeling the length of her step, savoring the small gesture of choosing how to carry herself. Later, when the episodes that made up the night were catalogued and discussed in the practical language of operational reports, Jima sat across from her and said, plainly, "You held." He did not praise her like a child. He recorded it like a fact. "You stood steady." She understood then what she had done was never about proving him right or wrong. It was about determining whether she would let the world tell her what she was. In the weeks that followed, she kept practicing the simple acts that had added up into a new identity. She continued to walk the penthouse with the exactness of one building a muscle. She learned to say no without apology. She took small trips into the parts of the city where her steps had once been light with fear. She rented a small studio apartment under a different name and spent afternoons there, sanding it into a comfortable anonymity that no one expected to associate with the man who ran the Dragon's Den. People around her did not offer the speeches that remake you anew. They offered the constancy of presence, security detail that made the world safer by habit, a woman who taught her how to manage a ledger of suppliers, a quiet man who did not try to be lover nor father, but who taught her that power can be a tool, and she did not become a moral convert to his enterprise. She never reached the place of calling his world noble. She kept that distance. She learned to accept what it provided without making it an excuse for the past or a promise for the future. The city did not become kinder in the arithmetic of markets. Men still found means to destroy one another for petty territory. There were nights she turned on the television and watched other families fall apart. Other men who thought dominance could be maintained with threats. Those scenes reminded her how fragile small changes could be in a world that did not honor them. Months later, in a moment that felt like an echo of something she had once been, she stood on a different subway platform at dusk. The bruise behind her ear had faded to a pale map. She wore a coat that fit better, and her bag, no longer a symbol of survival but an accessory, brought a small, deliberate color to her silhouette. She watched the city move and learned to see herself in its flow. She was still careful. She had not become fearless. Instead, she had become deliberate. A woman brushed past her and muttered an apology. A child looked up at the screens and imitated the train announcement. In the reflection behind the glass, Aretha saw herself not as hollow, but as a presence. For a panicked moment, she looked for a sign of Jerry in the crowd. and realized she did not feel the old animal fear that once lived in the muscles. Fear still lived in her sometimes, but it no longer dictated the geometry of her life. She had escaped a marriage that had been built on repetitive erasure. She had walked into the den of someone whose decisions were morally complicated and negotiated a place that allowed her to live and to choose. She had learned that isolation could be used as a tool to keep someone small. She had also learned that the same solitude, when chosen and shaped, could be the foundation upon which a person remade themselves. She did not pretend the path she walked was clean. There were moral shadows around the edges of her sanctuary. She did not romanticize them. She simply recognized that life is rarely tidy. On a rain-silvered morning several months later, she stood at a low cafe window and watched the city empty its umbrellas out into the street. Her reflection in the glass was steady. Someone sat down at her table, a man from the security team. He asked if she wanted to speak to the neighbors about a delivery schedule. She listened and then made a decision on the spot, small and practical. It was ordinary, and ordinary was an achievement. When the world asked who she had become, she did not offer a tidy label. She said quietly when asked by a woman at the coffee counter, "I'm taking up space." The woman nodded, as if understanding had a bodily form. That was the essence of it. She had recharted her relationship to her body, to her breathing, to the way she stood in rooms. Jerry's doctrine of orphanhood had been insistence that she was invisible, dispensable. She had used the very solitude he'd purchased as a weapon of his own undoing. She had turned aloneness into a map for building. There were consequences to living within the orbit of a man like Jima. People would always whisper about how one's safety might depend on uncomfortable arrangements. She accepted those whispers as part of the ledger. For Aretha, the more urgent ledger was her daily accounting of choice. She chose to remain in a world that had clear dangers, because that world also contained the means to claim a life she had not been allowed. She did not ask others to follow that road. She only asked for the right to keep building. Once, on a late evening walk, she paused on a bridge and looked down at the wet black ribbon of the river. The city reflected back in glints and streaks, cars like scattered coins. There was a particular peace to being momentarily small in a vast scene where nothing was fixed. She took her hands out of her coat pockets and thought of the subway seat, the red bag, the man with the dragon tattoo who had drawn a line and given her a chance to step across it. She felt the oddness of gratitude mixed with the absence of sentimentality. Her last exchange with Jerry had not involved a scene of revenge, nor a violent tableau for the sake of catharsis. He had been removed in the quiet way that humiliations can be removed, by their own revealing. His arrogance had been his undoing. She did not gloat. She simply moved on. The final image returns to where the story began, not as repetition, but as inversion. She stands now at a subway entrance, the city breathing around her. The bruises are gone. Her reflection in the glass shows a woman whose shoulders are held differently, whose eyes meet the world without the tremor she once carried. She walks into the car with purposeful steps. No one owns the trajectory of her life now except herself. She sits, not shrinking, not waiting for permission to exist. The train lurches, the city slides by, and she reads the faces with the steady, cool attention of someone who has learned to navigate danger, and who has learned that power is often a matter of how you set your shoulders before the room notices you. The story does not resolve into a tidy moral. There is no edict that criminal power cures domestic violence, no proclamation that all wounds will heal whole. Instead, there is a quieter truth. A woman who was told she was a ghost learned how to occupy the air. She escaped the private theology of abuse and moved into a space defined by choices. The deadliest leader she met did not fix her by being noble. He offered a scaffolding she could use. She did not exchange one cage for another. She traded the small daily tyrannies that had kept her small for a deliberate set of constraints that allowed the smallest miracle of all, the ability to choose. If this story touched you, leave a comment and share what held your attention. If you want more like this, subscribe. There are more stories that trace the thin, complicated line between survival and sovereignty.